It was just after 100 am when the phone rang. The kind of ring that cuts through silence like a blade. Sharp, urgent, and wrong. Officer Janet Morris had been with the precinct for over 18 years, and she knew these calls never brought good news. The dispatcher's voice was low. 911 received a welfare check request. Elderly woman seen outside, possibly abandoned. Address reads as a private residence. No signs of forced entry. Janet sighed. Elder neglect wasn't uncommon in this part of town, especially around winter holidays when some families preferred to simplify things. She grabbed her coat and keys. 15 minutes later, headlights bathed a suburban driveway. There, barely lit by the porch light, sat a frail woman wrapped in a thin cardigan, her hands trembling. No shoes, no luggage. Just a sealed manila envelope clutched to her chest like it held her last bit of dignity. When Janet asked her name, the woman whispered, Margaret. Margaret Doyle. This used to be my home. What Janet didn't know then, what no one knew, was that this woman's story would unravel an entire web of deceit, entitlement, and generational betrayal. Margaret Doyle had raised 3 children on her own after her husband died in a factory explosion in 1983. She was 38 then, with no college degree, no job, and a mortgage one signature away from foreclosure. But she fought. She worked night shifts cleaning hospitals and weekends at the local diner. She made sure her kids had shoes that fit and food on the table. Even if it meant she only ate toast with butter most nights. Now, at 78, her hands swollen from arthritis, and her knees barely holding her weight, she had been relocated to the front porch like an unwanted package. Her daughter-in-law, Shelby, handed her a coat and said coldly, "Until you figure out where you're going, don't come back in." You remaking the grandkids uncomfortable. It wasn't the first time Shelby had said something like that. Margaret had always tried to excuse it, stress, motherhood, generational differences. But this time, her son David stood behind Shelby, and said nothing. The house they lived in had been paid off with Margaret's pension. She had signed it over to David. Just to make sure it stays in the family. The family, it turned out, no longer included her. Earlier that day, Margaret had confronted Shelby about a $12,000 withdrawal from her savings account. Shelby brushed it off, saying it was for a family emergency. When Margaret pressed, voices rose, the kids overheard. David took Shelby's side. Hours later, Margaret's suitcase was zipped, her phone disconnected, and she was told, "You need to go stay with friends. We're overwhelmed." Friends. At nearly 80, most of them were either dead or in nursing homes. Her sister had passed away 2 winters ago. The church closed during the pandemic and never reopened. Now she sat, abandoned on the porch of the house she had cleaned, repaired, and poured her soul into for 40 years. She stared at the manila envelope in her lap. Inside were birth certificates, property records, and one handwritten letter labeled, "To the ones who forgot." She hadn't planned to share it yet. But maybe the time had come. From the window, she saw her grandchildren laughing in front of the TV. They didn't even know she was outside. In the distance, sirens echoed. To the outside world, David and Shelby Doyle were the portrait of a successful American family. David worked in corporate finance. Shelby ran a popular lifestyle blog about minimalist parenting, and their Instagram was filled with smiling photos, Thanksgiving dinners, pumpkin patch trips, and Pate-blessed captions. No one saw the dark undercurrent behind the curated perfection. The porch where Margaret now sat was a relic from the past. Decades ago, it held warm summer memories, birthday balloons, bedtime stories, and late-night conversations. Now it was just a stage for humiliation. The sofa they'd placed there for her wasn't even hers. It was an old love seat pulled from the garage, covered in pet hair and mildew stains. The cold bit through her cardigan as she lay curled up, trying to shield herself from the icy wind. Not one blanket. Not one goodbye. Inside, Shelby was live-streaming a tutorial about holiday decor on a budget. Her voice was cheerful. And remember, less is more when it comes to Christmas lighting. In the background, Margaret's silhouette was faintly visible through the frosted glass door. Like a ghost no one acknowledged. David sat silently in the kitchen, sipping wine. He kept glancing at the door but did nothing. Earlier that evening, their oldest son, Caleb, had asked, "Why is Grandma outside?" Shelby snapped. "She's taking some time to herself." Caleb frowned. "But it's freezing. Do you want to lose your iPad tonight?" She snapped again. He didn't ask again. The truth was, Margaret had become a liability. Shelby found her presence draining, her stories depressing, and her constant reminders of how things used to be irritating. When Margaret questioned the finances, Shelby saw it as betrayal. David, always avoiding confrontation, simply chose silence. They had built a world so carefully constructed on image and appearance, there was no room left for imperfection, especially not a fragile old woman who might speak uncomfortable truths. By 300 am, the temperature had dropped to 29 bf. Margaret's lips were blue. She had tried to stand but stumbled and sat back down. Her vision blurred. Her heartbeat slowed. But she clutched the manila envelope tighter, like a shield of forgotten justice. Across the street, an upstairs light flicked on. Mrs. Helen Whitaker, the widowed neighbor, squinted through the blinds and gasped. She recognized that figure. Margaret Doyle. What in God's name was she doing out there? She threw on her robe and slippers and stepped into the cold. Helen Whitaker didn't knock, she banged. The sound echoed through the house like a warning shot. Shelby paused her livestream mid-sentence, annoyed. David opened the door. "Helen," he asked, confused. She didn't waste time. "Your mother is outside. In 5-degree weather. Are you two out of your goddamn minds?" Shelby stepped in, arms crossed, a smirk forming. "Helen, we appreciate your concern, but Margaret insisted on some space. We didn't force her. Didn't force her. She's got hypothermia, Shelby." David turned pale. "She okay?" "No," Helen snapped. "She's freezing alone and humiliated. I called 911. Shelby's face dropped. "You what?" Helen didn't answer. Instead, she walked out and guided the paramedics to the porch, where Margaret was barely conscious. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, her hand opened just long enough for the manila envelope to fall to the floor. Helen picked it up. Back inside, David was silent. Shelby paced. "She's doing this to punish us," Shelby hissed. "She chose to stay out there." David looked at her for the first time all night. "Did she?" Silence. Shelby turned on him. "Don't start. You know how she is. Guilt trips, passive-aggressive comments, that whole martyr act. She's been manipulating us for years. By asking what happened to her money." David snapped. Shelby blinked. It came out sharper than he intended, but he was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending. From choosing Shelby over the woman who once worked 3 jobs so he could go to college. From ignoring the gnawing guilt every time he passed his mother in the hallway, frailer than the week before. "You knew she signed the house over," he continued. "You said we'd take care of her. This wasn't care." Shelby scoffed. "So now I'm the villain? The woman who runs your life, manages your kids, and built our entire social platform. Our life was built on her sacrifices," David said, quietly. "We just erased her from it." Shelby stormed upstairs. That night, David sat alone in the living room. The silence screamed louder than any argument. He stared at the old photos on the wall. Margaret holding him as a toddler, beaming on his graduation day, holding his firstborn with tears in her eyes. Somehow, along the way, those moments became inconvenient. His phone buzzed. A text from the hospital. Margaret Doyle stabilized. Mild hypothermia. Conscious but weak. You may visit in the morning. Beside it, Helen had left the manila envelope. David picked it up, hesitated, then opened it. Inside a copy of the deed transfer. Her pension receipts. His college acceptance letter with a note in her handwriting. "Whatever it costs, he'll go. Even if I don't." And the letter. Titled, "To the Ones Who Forgot." He didn't read it yet. He wasn't ready. The hospital room was quiet except for the faint beeping of machines and the steady whoosh of heated air. Margaret lay still, eyes half open, skin pale but no longer blue. When she turned her head slightly, she saw a familiar face, Helen Whitaker, sitting beside her with a thermos in her lap. "Chicken noodle," Helen said softly. "Homemade, no mess." Margaret blinked slowly. "You always hated cooking." Helen smiled. Turns out, it's not the cooking I hated, just the person I used to do it for. Margaret let out a weak laugh. Her first in days. Helen opened the thermos, poured some soup into a plastic bowl, and gently fed her friend spoon by spoon. Between sips, Margaret's voice grew a little stronger. They told me I was in the way, that I made everyone uncomfortable. You made them uncomfortable, Helen corrected. Because you remind them of things they'd rather forget. Sacrifice, humility, hard work, and consequences. Margaret sighed. Maybe I should have just gone quietly. Helen's voice sharpened. Don't you dare say that. She leaned in. You gave your entire life to those kids. You bled for them. Just because they want to rewrite history doesn't mean you have to disappear from it. Margaret stared at her, tears welling. What do I do now? Helen sat back and crossed her arms. You rest. You eat this damn soup. Then, when you're strong enough, we fight. Fight. I made some calls, Helen said. Social services, legal aid, even the local paper. Turns out elder abuse gets some traction when the victim is a war widow who gave away her house out of love. Margaret blinked. You're going to make this public? Helen nodded. If they wanted you silent, they should have treated you better. There was a pause. Then Margaret whispered. They're my children. Helen didn't flinch. Aren't you a human being? One doesn't cancel out the other. That afternoon, a young nurse stepped in and found the two women laughing. Really laughing. Over a shared memory of a broken washing machine, and a squirrel that once got stuck in Margaret's chimney. For a moment, they weren't just two elderly women battling loneliness. They were two survivors. Helen walked home afterward with a mission. She called a lawyer, she called the local news. And then she called David. He didn't answer. So she left a voicemail. Your mother is safe. I suggest you prepare for a conversation you should have had years ago. The phone at the Department of Adult Protective Services rang just after 8:00 am. Ops, this is Officer Reilly. A voice, low and deliberate, answered. I want to report suspected elder abuse. The address is 1294 Green Elm Lane. Victim's name is Margaret Doyle. 78 years old. Abandoned overnight by her son and daughter-in-law. No blanket, no shoes, in freezing temperatures. Reilly straightened in his chair. Can I get your name, sir? Silence. Then, let's just say, I used to owe her everything. Click, the call ended. By noon, Officer Reilly was reviewing Margaret's medical intake from the ER. Mild hypothermia. Early signs of dehydration. Emotional trauma. Patient hesitant to speak about her living conditions. Red flags were everywhere. He filed an urgent referral to a caseworker named Danielle Kim, known in the department for being relentless when it came to elder neglect cases. Danielle arrived at the hospital just as Margaret was finishing her second bowl of soup. Helen was sitting beside her with knitting needles, pretending not to eavesdrop. Mrs. Doyle. Danielle said gently. I'm with Adult Protective Services. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's all right. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Danielle pulled out a recorder. Are you aware that your children had a legal responsibility to provide for your care once they assumed ownership of your home? Margaret blinked. No one told me that. Did you sign over the house under the impression you'd be allowed to live there safely? Yes. Margaret whispered. That was the promise. Danielle paused. Was there ever any violence, physical threats? No, Margaret said. Just silence, coldness. I wasn't wanted. I was in the way. Helen interjected. You need to tell her about the money. Margaret looked down. Danielle leaned forward. What money? Margaret opened up. About the savings account, the 12,000 withdrawal, the argument, the eviction, the words that still echoed. You're making the grandkids uncomfortable. Danielle's tone shifted. That may qualify as financial exploitation and psychological abuse. She stood. We'll be opening a full investigation. Do you have any safe place to stay? Helen raised her hand without hesitation. She's staying with me. Danielle smiled. You're a good friend. Helen smiled back. No, just human. Later that evening, Danielle visited 1294 Green Elm Lane. Shelby opened the door in a full face of makeup and a designer robe. "Can I help you?" Danielle introduced herself and handed over official documentation. "We've received a report of elder neglect involving your mother-in-law, Margaret Doyle. You and your husband are both named in the complaint." Shelby's smile cracked for the first time. "I'm going to need to see the financial records," Danielle added. "Everything from the last 12 months. David appeared behind Shelby, pale as a ghost. For the first time, the truth had a badge. Danielle Kim returned to the app's office the next morning with a heavy file and 1,000 questions. As she reviewed the Doyle family's financial history, one item stood out: a wire transfer for $28,000 labeled Education Fund Private University. It had been made 15 years ago, to a college David Doyle never publicly mentioned. Curious, she ran his academic history. What she found didn't match the story he'd built. David had dropped out after one semester. There was no degree. But for years, he had told friends, neighbors, even his own mother, that he graduated with honors. His LinkedIn profile listed a dual degree in finance and business ethics. He had built an entire identity around a lie. Back at Helen's house, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, carefully folding laundry while Helen brewed tea. The letter David never read. To the ones who forgot. Sat unopened on the counter. "Should I send it?" she asked quietly. Helen shrugged. "That depends. Do you want to tell them the truth? Or do you want to make them feel something?" Margaret didn't answer. But that night, she picked up a pen and wrote an addendum to the letter. Just a single-page title. "Do you remember?" Meanwhile, Danielle visited the local college with a court order. Records confirmed David's enrollment and his expulsion. Not only had he dropped out, he had been caught plagiarizing a senior thesis to impress a professor. It never made it to Margaret. Instead, he told her he needed money to finish his final semester. That $28,000, it was used to pay off a private settlement, hush the scandal, and bury the truth. In return, the university kept it quiet. Margaret had sold her wedding ring and borrowed against her pension to send that money. Danielle included this in her official case file. That evening, David was sitting in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel. Outside the house he now realized he had inherited through deception. The family inside didn't feel like his anymore. Shelby was pacing, angry, disconnected. The kids were upstairs, oblivious. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, Margaret's, soft, steady, tired. "You don't need to lie anymore, David. Not to them. Not to me. Not to yourself. I knew you didn't graduate. I just didn't want you to feel like a failure." Silence. Then, "But what you did to me. That was the real disappointment." A click. David stared ahead, his own reflection hollow in the windshield. For the first time in years, he wasn't a father, or a husband, or a provider. He was just a boy who betrayed his mother. The courtroom was small, almost intimate, an ironic setting for a moment that would shatter the illusion of family. Margaret sat on the witness stand in a modest blue dress, hands trembling slightly but voice steady. Her hair, now fully silver, was pinned back neatly. Helen sat just behind her, clutching a tissue. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Doyle, you're here today to confirm the events leading to your removal from the property at 1294 Green Elm Lane, correct?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And can you tell the court what happened that night?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "I was told to leave. I was told I was making the grandchildren uncomfortable. I wasn't given a choice. I wasn't offered shelter or food or even shoes. I was just removed." Shelby shifted uncomfortably in her seat. David kept his head down. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Mrs. Doyle, were you aware at the time that the house had been transferred into your son's name?" "Yes. I signed it over willingly. I was told I would always have a place there." "And what changed?" Margaret's voice cracked. "They changed. Or maybe I just finally saw them for who they were." There was a pause. The room was silent. Then the defense attorney stood. "Mrs. Doyle, you've stated your children mistreated you. Is it possible that they were simply overwhelmed? That your presence, due to age, illness, or memory decline, became difficult to manage?" Margaret looked him dead in the eyes. Wasn't sick. I wasn't confused. I was inconvenient. Gasps whispered through the gallery. The prosecutor handed Margaret a document. Her letter. To the ones who forgot. Would you like to read this aloud? Margaret shook her head. No. I'd like him to read it. She turned. To David. For the first time in weeks, their eyes met. Hers were tired but firm. His were flooded with regret. The judge allowed a recess. Outside the courtroom, the press waited. The story had gained traction. Elderly mother abandoned by son in freezing weather, now testifying in court. A few signs waved outside. Justice for Margaret. And, protect our elders. Inside, David sat alone in a corner of the hallway, holding the letter. To the ones who forgot, I changed your diapers. I stayed awake during your fevers. I sold my memories to buy your future. I was never perfect, but I was always there, and when I needed someone to remember me. Not for what I gave, but for who I was. You turned your back. This isn't vengeance. This is a reminder. You don't bury the living. He wept silently. Shelby stood behind him, unmoved. Margaret, from the bench, closed her eyes. She had already lost her family once. Now, at least, she had her truth. 3 days after the court hearing, Margaret met with her attorney, Evelyn Brackett. A sharp-tongued woman in her 60s who had seen enough family betrayals to no longer be shocked. But this case, it still got to her. Evelyn placed a thick folder on the desk and looked Margaret in the eye. Are you sure you want to proceed with the amendment? Margaret nodded slowly. They've had enough of me. They won't want what's left. Unless it's worth money. Evelyn opened the manila envelope. The very one Margaret had clutched to her chest on that frozen porch. Inside was more than just personal letters and documents. It contained an original copy of her late husband's military service benefits. A policy never claimed, worth just over $380,000. She had kept it a secret for decades, thinking one day she might use it to support the grandkids' education. But now, she knew better. Also inside was a sealed envelope addressed to Caleb, Emmy, and Jody. My grandchildren. It was a new will. One Margaret had signed that very morning, all assets, including the pension remainder, military benefits, and a private land parcel in Vermont that no one in the family even knew she still owned, were to be held in a trust, released only when the grandchildren reached the age of 25, with a stipulation. They must complete 100 hours of community service with verified documentation, specifically in elder care, hospice support, or social service volunteer work. Only then will they inherit. If not, the assets would be redirected to a nonprofit supporting abandoned seniors. Helen, seated beside her, smirked. That's the most poetic revenge I've ever seen. Margaret shook her head. It's not revenge. It's a second chance. For them to learn what their parents never did. Meanwhile, David and Shelby had received a legal notice informing them that they were explicitly removed from any financial inheritance. Past, present, or future. Included was a letter from Margaret addressed to them. Handwritten. You taught your children to look away. I'm teaching them to look again. Shelby exploded when she read it. She had money this whole time. Land. Military benefits. That old witch. David didn't say a word. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at the clause regarding the grandchildren. The one stipulation he never saw coming. For the first time, he realized his mother didn't want to destroy him. She wanted to rebuild what he'd broken. Margaret returned home. Not to 1294 Green Elm Lane, but to Helen's guest room. A modest place filled with plants, old books, and warmth. She hung a single photo by the bed, her children when they were young, in happier times. Maybe they'll come back one day, she said softly. Helen replied, and if they don't? Margaret smiled, not bitter, not broken. Just honest, then I'll be okay anyway. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the knock came. Not urgent, not angry. Just hesitant. Margaret opened the door and froze. Shelby stood there, mascara smudged, eyes red, and hair pulled back like she hadn't slept in days. In her hand, she clutched a wrinkled envelope. She started. I read the new will. Margaret said nothing. I know you don't want to cede me. I get it. But, I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't think you'd. Fight back. Margaret finished for her, voice calm. Shelby looked away. I just wanted space. Boundaries. I never meant to throw you out like that. I was overwhelmed. You were cruel. Margaret said plainly. You weren't overwhelmed. You were calculating. Shelby blinked. That's not fair. You coached your children to ignore me. You erased me from a home I helped pay for. You told your friends I was declining, when I was simply inconvenient. That's not overwhelmed, Shelby. That's design. Shelby's voice cracked. You don't think I regret it? Margaret tilted her head. Do you regret it? Or do you regret being caught? Silence hung in the air like fog. Shelby pulled out the wrinkled envelope. This was from your letter. I made Caleb read it. He cried. I cried. I'm not here to ask for money. I'm here to say I'm sorry. Margaret hesitated. For a moment, she saw something fragile in Shelby. Maybe even sincere. Or maybe just desperation dressed as remorse. I told my kids what we did was wrong. Shelby added. I told them that from now on, we talk about you like you're still alive. Because you are, and you matter. Margaret stepped outside, rain softly falling on her shoulders. She looked Shelby in the eyes. Words are easy, she said. What are you going to do? Shelby swallowed. I signed up for a volunteer shift. At Catherine's nursing center. Caleb too. We start this weekend. That caught Margaret off guard. You did that on your own. No. Helen called me. Shelby admitted. She told me if I didn't show my children what consequence looked like, they'd become just like me. Margaret almost smiled. Shelby stepped back. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want you to know. I see it now. What you did. What we threw away. Margaret looked past her. For a second, the memory of young Shelby flashed in her mind. The bright, ambitious girl David brought home from college. Before the image. Before the pride. Then she gently closed the door. Inside, Helen raised an eyebrow. Well, Margaret sighed. Maybe she's changing. Helen shrugged. Maybe, or maybe she just realized you're the only one in this story who still has a soul that shines. Margaret chuckled softly. Then whispered. Let's hope redemption doesn't need an audience. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood beneath the faded banner of the Jefferson County Senior Advocacy Summit, flanked by a podium, folding chairs, and a sea of unfamiliar faces. She had never spoken in public before, never imagined herself being the face of anything. But when the local paper ran the headline, 78-year-old woman abandoned by her children becomes voice for elder justice, the calls started flooding in, from state representatives, from local nonprofits, from other forgotten seniors who whispered over the phone. Me too. Helen stood nearby, her phone ready to record. Daniel Kim from APS sat in the front row, and somewhere in the crowd, standing, not sitting, was David. Margaret stepped up to the microphone. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. My name is Margaret Doyle. I was a mother, a wife, a worker, a homemaker. I spent 40 years believing that if I just gave enough of my time, my love, my body, there would be a return. But there's no interest rate on sacrifice. One day, I woke up to find that I had raised strangers, and that being family means nothing if there's no humanity. The crowd was still. I'm not here to name names. I'm not here to punish. I'm here because there are thousands like me. People who built homes, who fought wars, who worked 2 jobs. Now sleeping in cars or forgotten in care homes, because someone decided they were expired. A murmur moved through the audience. Of agreement, of recognition, of pain. But we are not disposable, we are not burdens, and our stories, no matter how quietly lived, deserve to be heard. Applause erupted. Some stood, some cried. David watched, still as stone, as his mother transformed from the woman he left on a porch to a woman who shook the system. After the event, a local news anchor asked, Mrs. Doyle, what do you want people to take away from today? Margaret smiled. Not bitterly, not proudly, but with quiet resolve. I want them to go home and look their parents in the eyes and ask, have I seen you lately? That evening, Margaret sat on Helen's porch with a blanket wrapped around her legs and tea in hand. The same porch where years ago, She and her late husband used to watch the stars. Helen handed her a piece of mail. From the office of the mayor, she said, grinning. Margaret opened it. Inside was a certificate, Margaret Doyle Day, honoring the resilience of elders in our community. Helen raised her teacup. You've come a long way from that frozen sofa. Margaret smiled. I've only just begun. Time doesn't scream when it leaves. It slips out quietly. Through the lines on our parents' faces, through the slow shuffle of their steps, through the silence after the last dinner we never returned for. Margaret Doyle became a symbol, yes. But she never wanted that. She wanted family, warmth, a place to sit at the table without being resented for it. She got a podium instead. And sometimes, the ones who speak the loudest are the ones who were silenced the longest. In the months that followed, donation drives sprang up across the state. Margaret's Law was introduced. Legislation protecting seniors from coercive property transfers. Nursing home volunteers tripled. Her story was added to a university ethics course titled Invisible Lives. David never moved back into the house, but he did visit, once a week, without fail. He never asked for forgiveness, and Margaret never offered it. But she always kept a second cup of tea waiting. Not out of habit, but out of hope. Because in the end, Margaret wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a generation no one thought would fight back. And this time, the world listened.